This is the Voice of Russia. The London Bureau of the Voice of Russia is now live on digital radio and online, with news, comment and debate on weekdays between 4 and 7 p.m.
Welcome to the Voice of Russia's Daily Debate. I'm Vivienne Nunis. Since the global financial crisis in 2008, many of the world's largest economies have battled with recession, particularly in Europe. To solve the crisis there, the European Union has enforced a program of austerity, with severe cuts and ever smaller budgets demanded of governments battling mountains of debt. That's unleashed a wave of anti-austerity feeling, with riots in Athens, protests in Spain, and a wave of demonstrations across the continent on May Day. Already this year, governments in the Netherlands and Romania have collapsed under the weight of anti-austerity opposition, and this weekend, France's president and Eurozone champion Nicolas Sarkozy is widely expected to be replaced by socialist candidate François Hollande. Greeks will also go to the polls in an election that's likely to result in a hung parliament, amid increased support for parties opposed to Brussels' tough bailout demands. Today we'll pose the question, is austerity working? And if it is working, economically, are the social and political costs too high? We'll also look at economies in the United States and here in Britain. Joining me here in the London studio is Professor Stephen Haseler, Director of the Global Policy Institute, Mark Littlewood from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Kimberley Trewhitt from the independent pro-market think tank Reform. And joining me on the phone from America is the Professor Peter Morici from the University of Maryland. To start today's discussion, I'd first like to ask each of you about Europe. We've seen countries like Portugal largely adhere to Brussels orders, cutting spending and wages, rolling back pensions and increasing tax in a bid to reduce its deficit. Yet Portugal's debt as a proportion of gross domestic product is growing as the economy shrinks. The debt to GDP ratio has also doubled in Spain and Greece. Is then austerity working? I'll start with Stephen Haseler from the Global Policy Institute. Stephen, what's your view?
Well, it obviously isn't working. It's not working because as you cut the deficit, or try to cut the deficit, unemployment grows. We now have 50% of youth unemployment in Spain, extraordinary numbers, 25% normal unemployment that we haven't seen for decades. This undercapacity means that we have no growth. If you don't have growth, you can't get your tax revenues up. If you can't get your tax revenues up, you can't cut your deficit. So intriguingly, austerity leads to deficit enhancement, deficit growth, rather than deficit reduction. And it's what the centre-right governments over Europe, all over Europe, we've had centre-right governments the last few years, they've got it fundamentally wrong. And we're going to have a challenge to this thesis on Sunday, I believe, when we have a new French president who will lead a coalition involving Mario Monti, even the Spanish Prime Minister, people in Holland and the Social Democrats in Germany, who are going to try a different approach across the whole European continent. Very interesting times indeed.
I'll go to you then, Mark Littlewood. Do you think those centre-right governments in Europe have got it fundamentally wrong?
No, I think it's an absolute necessity. We have spent here in the UK and pretty much across Europe at least a decade spending more money than we have been bringing in and making long-term promises around, for example, public sector pensions that we can't possibly keep. So we have to find some sort of way of squaring this circle. It is not nice and pleasant to throw public sector workers out of work, but you have to at some point balance the books. And to take Stephen's point, I mean, the way out of this is not to continue with the policies that got us into this problem in the first place. It would be a lovely idea to believe that if we gave every man, woman and child in Western Europe an extra 10,000 euros, we would somehow be able to spend our way out of the recession. We wouldn't. We would just be adding enormously to the debt. So it is tough medicine. We have to learn the lessons of the last decade and longer, that we cannot spend beyond our means. There isn't actually a great deal of austerity going on, certainly in the United Kingdom, with real term cuts of about 1%. 4%, and we have got to get used to balancing the books and governments merely spending what they get in tax revenue, no more.
I'll bring in Peter Morici then from the University of Maryland over in America. Mr. Morici, you've been watching what's happening in Europe. Have governments been taking the right path?
No, I don't believe that they have. I mean, it's certainly true that the public sector has to be shrunk in Europe. It's one of the things that keeps the continent from growing. However, you can't do it as rapidly as they're doing it. That's the problem. And you can't do it with other constraints on the ability of Europe to grow. The euro is a terrible mistake. It's overvalued for the Mediterranean countries and undervalued for Germany and a few other northern economies, which creates enormous imbalances in trade and makes it virtually impossible for the southern countries to come up with any regime that will permit them to repay their debts. But it's very, very difficult to say we're going to shrink the government a little bit at a time so we can continue to grow and use austerity against the backdrop of all of these problems and also just political impatience on the part of voters. I mean, for 2 generations now, Italian politicians have been telling folks there they can retire at 55. And the demographic tables just don't work.
We've seen people getting very frustrated in Spain, in Greece particularly. Is it too much what they're having to go through? They're losing their jobs, they're having their pensions rolled back, they're having to face more and more cuts from the government. Is this too much as a quality of life point of view?
Of course it is. Look, what's happened basically is the collapse of Wall Street in 2008 is the fundamental event of our time. And what is the collapse of Wall Street, though? The collapse of Wall Street was the collapse of the private credit sector. And the collapse of this private sector, of course, landed the governments of the world, particularly the governments of Europe, with a huge problem. They had increasing unemployment that put pressure on their welfare states, and also the governments bailed out the banks. No wonder the governments have deficits. You see, this is not fundamentally a government crisis. The government are trying to ameliorate the social costs of the huge private sector banking collapse which occurred in 2008. And if you look at it that way, you can understand, can't you, how ordinary people in Spain and Greece and Britain and Germany and France are saying, why should we pay for the collapse of this banking system that no politician in the 1990s and early 2000s ever got to grips with, letting it rip, letting the most unbelievable scandals take place in this financial industry. And that's the essential problem. It's as simple as that.
Mark, I'll put that to you. Why should the ordinary person pay for a mistake in a crisis that was caused by the banks?
Well, Stephen is right in one aspect, that the 2008 financial crash has brought all of these underlying problems into sharp relief. But let us not believe that just prior to the crash, government finances in each European country were in good order. They were not. We were racking up deficits here even during the good times. So yes, 2008 was a diabolical shock to the system. I think there are enormous structural lessons to learn about banks and banking for the future, but it simply brought this problem forward. We were heading for a car smash anyway. Here in the UK, we've made colossal promises on public sector pensions. There is no credible plan to stick to or to keep. Now, the banking crisis and the fact that economic growth has gone into reverse exacerbates that problem. But even if we'd had economic growth of plus 2 or 3% since 2008 rather than minus 2 or 3%, the underlying problem, namely spending more than you are bringing in as a government, is what's really the underlying cause, even if it's the banking crisis that's brought it into a sharp
Could I just come
relief.
back on that? Government spending, government irresponsibility in terms of the actual numbers, the trillions of dollars and pounds and euros involved, was nothing as compared with the private debt, the private printing created by these out-of-control banks in 2000. I mean, government deficits are nothing compared with banking deficits. We just don't look at it that way round. We're always concentrating on governments, but their problem is relatively small in terms of the overall numbers. And I'll just give you a point on this. When they looked at what the debt levels were for these banks, so the kind of things that have been created by derivatives and all that kind of stuff, we were talking about quadrillions of dollars that have been printed. And if you compare those, and it is printed, by the way, if banks make loans, that, in my view, is a printed money conjured up of nowhere, which is just the same as money conjured up by governments when their balance sheets get out of control. So my point basically is I see the governments essentially as mopping up operations here. here, not the point that Mark and a lot of neoliberal economists are making, that the governments are the cause of this crisis. I don't see them as the cause of it. I agree there may have been overspending. I'm not criticising that. But when you look in the round about how much money was created and asset bubbles and all that, I don't see the governments as the fundamental cause of this.
This is The Voice of Russia in London. We might take the debate across the pond to the United States now. Many economists have pointed to the US as an economy on the rise. Unemployment is steadily falling and companies report business is improving. In his latest budget, President Barack Obama made clear he's shifting the focus from slashing budgets to creating jobs, saying you can't cut your way to growth. He's increased spending on education, infrastructure, research and development, and put off deficit reduction for later down the track. So is stimulus the way out of this crisis? Is stimulus the answer? Peter Morici, you're on the line from Maryland. Is Obama's policy of shot-in-the-arm stimulus more effective than the belt-tightening here in Europe?
The United States has got budget problems of a rather large nature, which will sooner or later get it, just the way they're catching up with France right now, not so much in the way they're catching up with Greece. We have state budget problems that are very, very chronic because a lot of the pensions are down there. But the president's policy, to be very honest, is one of getting through November. The deficit was supposed to be smaller for 2012, but he has calculated that is no way to get reelected. We've had president after president promise to get our deficit under control, and the only two that effectively did that were Clinton and Bush. The others have basically been big spenders. But we're never really going to get any place in this discussion if liberals want to refer to conservatives as neoliberals and blame all the problems on the bankers, and if conservatives have blind faith in free enterprise and the banks and want to blame all the problems on the government. The reality is the fiscal structure of Europe simply is unworkable, and even with sound banks, and I don't believe it would be possible to have sound banks with the fiscal structure of Europe, Europe's finances would be unworkable. For example, banks hold a lot of the European government debt because they really couldn't sell it to anybody else. So, I think that there's problems in both areas, and they're very closely related. In the United States, Barack Obama's, up on Wall Street, talking about regulation in the morning and then raising money from bankers in the afternoon. He really, hasn't done a very effective job of dealing with the banking problem, and any more than he's done a very effective job of dealing with, government spending.
What has been the reason then the American economy has sort of recovered better than economies over in Europe, though?
Well, we have a single currency like the Europeans do and an economy of comparable size, but we have a fiscal union. And we also have much more mobility of people because we have a single language and culture. So we're much more of a genuinely integrated economy in a way that Brussels can only dream about, simply because of who we are and how we're structured, and would be difficult to replicate in Europe. There is a fantasy in Europe that if you follow some cookbook prescriptions that have been formulated by German politicians in a society that is not known for its contributions to modern economics, that, for example, if they all had stuck to their budget restrictions, that everything would have been okay. They wouldn't have been. Greece wouldn't have drowned, but it would have gradually smothered in the way that Britain smothered in the 50s with a fixed exchange rate when the pound was overvalued. It would have chronic deficits. It wouldn't be able to find a way out other than through fiscal austerity, which would drag the economy down, but more slowly than what is going on now. It was not only Thatcher's policy of rolling back the frontiers of the state a bit in Britain that was important, but it was also the abandonment of a fixed exchange rate system, which helped liberate the British economy and helped it grow. There's a lot of things you need to have a common currency, and this is a well-developed area of international economics in which I have a burden of a terribly expensive education, and they're not met in Europe.
Can I just say something about that? I think this is a great misunderstanding of what the euro is all about. The euro is a political project. It's something economists don't understand. If you look at the history, if they have a grasp of history, a grasp of political philosophy, a grasp of geopolitics, the euro was set up following the end of the Cold War in order to bind Germany into the Western world by Chancellor Kohl and President Francois Mitterrand. And we may be about to get some more statesmen in Europe after Sunday who will look at this in a political sense. And that the idea of Europe was that if we solve our problems nationally by having throughout Europe 27 floating currencies, we're simply going to be picked off by the Chinese, and we're going to be picked off by the Americans, and we're going to be picked off by the markets. The markets will arbitrage as between us, and we will be driven down into even more immiseration than it looks we're getting at the moment. So I don't think any national solution to this global financial crisis is at all possible. The only possibility is a Europe-wide solution. And if we try and get national solutions to it, which the British government wants, we're going to be crushed by the international markets. So I think you need to look at the euro as a political project which has a lot of problems in it, a lot of flaws in it, but at the moment we're now moving to resolve this by setting up a fiscal treaty, moving to a more federalist system in which we're going to have some kind of economic government for Europe as a way out of this solution. And I want to know where the private sector are going to get growth from, because the private sector is not lending, the banks are not lending to anybody. The Conservative government here has been saying give the private sector enough space to grow. It's not growing. The whole thing has to be kick-started by the state. It's the normal system. The state comes in to bail out the private sector when it can't perform.
Peter Morici from the University of Maryland, what's your response?
Well, I don't know that the state can spend any more money than it was already spending going into the crisis, and the most recent crisis, not the financial crisis, but the problem of investors losing confidence in Greece and Italy and Spain. At that point, deficits were so large that to further spend to try to kickstart their economies was impossible because they wouldn't have been able to borrow any more money. You know, it's all well and good to lecture American economists under the assumption that I'm sitting here in front of a mathematical model, which I'm not, sir. And I have a better sense of history probably than you do.
Oh, dear.
Hold on. And to say that this is a political and historical project, you can say the same thing about American Social Security, but the American Social Security system is coming apart simply because the retirement age is too low. No matter what currency system you have, no matter what kind of fiscal treaty you have, if you tell people they can retire at 55, it doesn't work. You don't get enough working years out of people to finance the pensions that you require, to have the intergenerational transfers. It's a simple accounting problem. Whether you're a Soviet bureaucrat or an American free market banker, it's the same problem. Europe does need to push back the frontiers of the state and promise people less, require them to work longer, just like is going to be required in the United States and has been playing out in some of our states like Ohio and Wisconsin, and which have been reacting in much the way people are reacting in Europe. They're throwing politicians out for bringing reality to bear. This is a problem of basic structural issues in Europe that need to be straightened out, including the banks. I will acknowledge that. However, they're not getting straightened out by just, mindless austerity or some sort of blind faith that if we just get our budgets right, the euro will save us. It won't.
Kimberley Trewhitt, I saw you nodding your head there in agreement. Do you think we all need to work a bit longer and retire a bit later?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd actually quite like to pick up on a few of the points that have been raised, because I think we're perhaps not considering the full implications of if we were to sort of, spend and try and stimulate our economy. We've got to recognise that sort of that fiscal loosening would come at quite a large cost, and also, look at how great an impact that might have. So there have been some studies, sort of, I know one by the IFS, which have shown that £20 billion of fiscal loosening might lead to a 0.1 to 0.2% increase in GDP. So we have to sort of put this into perspective of how big an impact this might have, at the same time recognising that that is additional debt that we're taking on board. And the fact that, we've held sort of in this country, markets have sort of held their confidence in us. And when we were put on negative outlook earlier in the year by two of the credit ratings agencies, there was a very clear signal there that, discretionary fiscal loosening would lead to that loss of confidence. So that's an important point to remember. And also on this retirement age point, we've got to think of this as sort of a longer term issue as well. So at the moment, yes, we're having a lot of short term pain and austerity cuts. And yes, we're not sort of arguing that, this is a good thing that people are losing their jobs and that kind of thing. But we have these aging populations, and we're already, by sort of 2040, we're going to be spending another £30 billion a year than we currently are on pensions. We're going to be spending another £40 billion on NHS and all of these kinds of things, adding to that spending.
Well, you've raised the issue of the UK economy there, so we'll bring this discussion a little bit closer to home. Prime Minister David Cameron and Chancellor George Osborne have embarked on a series of spending cuts, as you said, the likes of which some people say haven't been seen since World War II. But the UK has suffered a double-dip recession with 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. The opposition Labour Party says the coalition is cutting too far, too fast. And Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor, argues that without growth and without jobs, you can't get the deficit down. Mark Littlewood, do you agree with the government's economic strategy?
I agree with about half of it, and it's. I mean, they've in political communication terms, they've made a gross error because they, when they came to office, they said, "We are going to take a chainsaw to the public finances. This is going to be a sort of holocaust of public spending, the likes of which no one has ever seen before. No stone will be left unturned in our desire to save money." It looks like actually over the course of the Parliament, in real terms, they will cut public spending by around about 1%. That's to say they will be spending 99 pence at the next election for every £1 that the outgoing Labour government was spending. I mean, if that's austerity, I wouldn't want to see what largesse is. These are trivial cuts, which have been enormously overstated. Now, it is true to say that, I think it's true to say that in none of our lifetimes in the United Kingdom have we actually had a government that's cut public spending at all, and they are cutting it in real terms, but it's a very, very modest cut. They are adding hundreds of billions to the national debt. And the bit they've got wrong, where at least in the rhetoric I have some sympathy with what Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor, says, is clearly we need growth and jobs. And the coalition government here seems to be basing their private sector strategy more or less on the power of prayer, simply saying to businesses, it's time for you to step up to the plate, while not obviously doing anything that actually makes it easier to run a business and employ people. And the power of prayer is not good enough, I'm afraid.
Stephen Haseler from the Global Policy Institute.
Well, I completely agree with that. Look, according to the government, of course, we haven't begun to see the most of these cuts yet. They're in the pipeline. But I have to remind all the economists who talk about this, there are social problems and political problems associated with continuing to cut, as the British government are doing, as the Spanish government are doing. No one seems to take into account that if you have a 50% unemployment rate or a 25% amongst young people, that this has any consequences for future revolutionary ideas. You know, if you had an understanding of history, you would understand that if you push this too far, the whole system becomes a problem. So I still come back to my point here that the private sector basically collapsed in 2008, the private sector throughout the Western world, the private credit sector, it is still not back on its feet. There's no way we can get growth except from the public sector, no matter how difficult that may be. And without growth, we're not going to deal with the debt problem. There's only 2 ways. I don't know, our economists will know this better than I do. Aren't there only 2 ways to deal with debt? You either grow your way out or you default on it, don't you? Well, if we don't want to default, we've got to get growth somehow. And the centre-right governments of Europe don't seem to be getting it. And the Obama administration seems to be getting it a bit. So there may be some lessons there for us.
Have we still got you on the line, Peter Morici?
I think it's important to recognize that the British and American situations are very, very different than the continent of Europe because they're outside of the Eurozone. They have their own currencies. They're fairly large economies with their own currencies. So their circumstances are very different than, say, a Spain or Greece. I don't know that it's fair to say that the Obama administration policies are working or not working because the United States is growing but very, very slowly and nowhere near its potential. The real problem here is a third way has to be found to find growth. The banks must be reformed, and the Obama administration has done no better job, in fact, probably not as good a job as the British have done in responding to the banking crisis and re-regulating the banks properly. It isn't that a single currency is a bad idea, but a single currency has to make sense in the context of other fiscal institutions and governmental institutions, for example, that Europe simply doesn't have and are not on the drawing boards in a tangible and real way in the next 2 or 3 years to turn Europe around. But as I said, if we're going to continue with this blind adherence to the notion that austerity is good or that the government can spend their way out, we know that both those things can't happen. Austerity's not working. The euro's not working. Youth unemployment at 50% in Spain. The headline unemployment is at the level it was at the peak of the Great Depression in the United States. It's just not working there. Unless we're going to put a gun to people's heads and make them buy Greek bonds, there was no more capacity to spend. Now, what's being done to Greece right now is essentially a mugging by the German government. Greece is going to emerge from this, and Spain are going to emerge from this so much worse off than they went in. I just don't see this coming to any good end. Social disintegration will happen.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today I'm asking, is austerity working? I'll ask each of you, before we wrap up, where you see the Eurozone in 5 years. Kimberley, I'll start with you. Will the bailout packages and austerity measures we've seen be a success, or will the single currency collapse?
I think that's very hard to say. I think the one thing I would say is looking in the longer term, if we were to see sort of a breakdown of the euro, we would need to think very carefully about, how much the cost that would imply, and look at that. It's not kind of necessarily a clear-cut decision between, will it be there and will it not?
Stephen Haseler, what do you think? Where do you see the euro in 2017?
I think all depends on what happens with the new phase we're about to enter in Europe, in which we are going to abandon the austerity programme of the German government. Difficult though that may be, it's going to happen, in my view, because of the unemployment and the social tensions. We're going to have a new coalition which is going to engage in a degree of Rooseveltian economics, so to speak, and we'll see whether that does kickstart growth. The global economic system itself is going to be dependent on how we handle this next phase in Europe. But the austerity, in my view, this experiment with austerity is coming to an end. We'll see what the next phase is like.
Is the age of austerity coming to an end, Mark Littlewood? Where will the euro be in 5 years?
I think the age of austerity hasn't even started. We have actually got out the nail clippers when we should have got out the chainsaw. We have pledges on public sector pensions that we simply cannot keep. Are absolutely implausible that we're going to pay people what we've promised to pay them in 20 years' time. There is simply inconceivable, even if you are very optimistic about growth, that we will be able to meet those liabilities. I'm a moderate pessimist. I think that the Eurozone will keep sort of chugging along, and we will experience in Western Europe rather poor and miserable growth rates of about 1% or so on average. We won't get takeoff, but we probably won't collapse into a total depression either.
Peter Morici, what's your view? What's going to happen in the Eurozone in the next 5 years?
Well, I don't see either the present policies solving the problem or loosening a little bit and getting some Rooseveltian economics solving the problems, because the structural changes that are necessary and that have been promised by my social democratic friends, I just don't see on paper coming forward. So it really is a function of how long Europeans will put up with it. How long will the Spaniards put up with 25, 30, 35% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, and importantly, they're bright young people leaving the country for places like Brazil. At some point, people will throw up their arms and say enough, but at what point do they say enough? Europe is a very civilized place. I don't expect a French Revolution, but right now, if you look at how the elections are being played out, they're being played out in terms of spending more money, not fixing what's broken. So it's really a function of how long Europeans are willing to put up with it.
Well, that's the end of our debate today. I'd like to thank each of our guests for joining me here at The Voice of Russia in London. We heard from Peter Morici from the University of Maryland, Stephen Haseler from the Global Policy Institute, Kimberley Trewhitt from Reform, and Mark Littlewood from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you all very much for your time.